Hi, this is In the Garden, and I'm Andrew Grossman, and today we're in my garden where I'm going to show you how to trim your roses once they finish their first flush of bloom, and also how to trim your peonies, and then we're going to revitalize an old stand of bearded iris. So come along with me and we'll start with some roses. Now there are two basic reasons for why you want to deadhead or cut off the old flowers from your rose bushes. The first reason is that cutting off the old flowers encourages the bush to continue blooming because it isn't going to be putting energy into making rose hips, which are actually the seed and the fruit of the rose. The other reason is that rose bushes obviously look a lot nicer when they aren't covered with dead flowers. Now, trimming your rose bushes after they bloom is very easy to do, and the basic rule of thumb is that you want to cut the flower stems down to the first set of leaves that has at least 5 leaflets. The leaflets are the individual smaller leaf parts that make up the entire leaf. So what I'm going to do here is actually go down even a little lower on this bush because I don't want to see, if I were to cut it, say, up here, I don't want to see this amount of stem. The bush will look a lot nicer if I actually cut it a little bit lower down into here. That way you don't see any of the cut stem sticking up and the bush looks a lot nicer. Now, if you want to get very particular about it, when this bush starts to grow again, the new stems will come out at the angle of the old leaf. So the next stem that comes out of this rose bush is going to angle this way. If I want the bush to angle another direction, then I would cut down to a leaf that is angled in that direction. So if we look at this stem over here, if I want the bush to grow towards this bush, I will cut down to this leaf and simply take this off as close to that as possible. Now, it's very easy to just go through and do them all very quickly, just like this. And when you're done, your rose bush, of course, doesn't have flowers, but it certainly looks a lot nicer than it did when we started. Let me show you another bush. Now, this is a series of roses called knockout roses, which have recently come onto the market and are very, very popular because they're disease resistant, they bloom all summer long, they come in different colors, and they're very, very easy to grow. Now, technically, these roses don't need to be deadheaded. They will continue to bloom regardless. But I find that the whole bush looks a lot nicer if you take the dead flowers off. Now, with these bushes, the first set of leaves with 5 is actually right underneath the flower, the old flower stem. So with these bushes, you really just need to nip off right at the top, just like that. And if you go through and do the whole bush, even though this bush is sort of at the end of its first wave of flowering, when I finish taking off the old flowers, the new flowers that remain look a lot nicer. So this is also a way just to keep your garden looking fresh and neat. I find it sort of a relaxing thing to do in the evening, and it's very easy. Now let's take a look at another rose bush that actually doesn't require deadheading. This is a Rosa rugosa hybrid. Rosa rugosas are sort of the classic beach rose that everybody who lives in New England sees when you go to Newport or you go to Westport or you go down to the beach. Now this rose makes beautiful orange rose hips, which are the fruit. And you can see that it's just starting to make the hips now. And this rose will continue to flower and look terrific even without the deadheading. So this is a rose that I don't deadhead. And you can see already the first flush of bloom has gone by, but here comes a whole nother flush of bloom. The foliage on this rose is also really beautiful and very disease resistant. So this is a rose that doesn't really need to be deadheaded. Let's go over here and look at a climbing rose. This rose, which is just finishing bloom, only blooms once. So you may say, well, if it's not going to bloom again, why cut off the dead flowers? Well, obviously there's the aesthetic reason for doing it, but also when the dead flowers stay on, and I'll bring one down that I cut earlier, they tend to get moldy. You can see that there's a lot of mold on these old flowers, and mold is anathema to roses. You really don't want a lot of mold on your rose bushes. So I recommend cutting off the dead flowers so that they don't get moldy. Particularly in the last couple of weeks, we've had a tremendous amount of rain, and that has actually shortened the life of a lot of the rose flowers. They've gone quickly, they've browned, and they've started to get moldy, so you want to take them off. Now with a lot of climbing roses, the stems that bloomed this year won't bloom heavily next year. But if you look up higher in the bush, you can see these tall, upright stems coming up. A little bit later in the season, what I'm going to do is cut off these old stems and tie the new stems back down over the arch, because it's the new stems that will bloom very heavily next year. While we're talking about trimming, let's just take a look at another completely different plant. A lot of people ask me, when is the right time to prune your lilacs? Okay, this is a Japanese lilac. It's called Syringa palabin. And you can see that it finished blooming a little while ago, so there's no problem with cutting these off if you want to. If you want to prune this bush more, you would want to prune it right after it finishes blooming. I have clients who call me up and say, my lilacs don't bloom. Well, as it turns out, their landscaper has been pruning them in the fall. If you prune most spring blooming bushes in the fall, you'll cut off all the latent flower buds that will produce the flowers for next year. So with pretty much any bush that blooms before June 15th, you don't want to prune them in the fall. You want to prune them right after they bloom. Now come along with me and I'll show you how to prune a peony when it finishes blooming. Okay, now I'm standing in front of what was a beautiful peony called Sarah Bernhardt. Now you can see that now it looks rather ratty. Because of all the rain, the petals haven't fallen, they've just gotten stuck together and they're not coming off of the bush. So this really isn't a pretty part of your landscape anymore. Now peonies do not continue to grow once their first flush of bloom is over. So no matter how I trim this, What I leave behind is all that will be there for the entire rest of the season until frost. So you want to prune it in a way that is going to make it a nice looking plant in your garden for the rest of the season. Now I have these all staked up, so the first thing I'm going to do is cut the string off of them. And then I'm going to pull the stakes out because it's actually easier to do the pruning if the flower heads fall over slightly. Now the way you prune a peony is that you want to take off the stem, the part of the stem that flowered, a little bit lower than the final height of the bush. So that way you don't see any cut stems. So we're going to do this again. We come through here. If I were to prune this up like this, then you would see this stem sticking up in here, which isn't very pretty. So I want to take this down, all the way down into here. And that way, you end up with a nice round looking bush. Again, over here. You also will want to, in this case, try to go through and just pull off all these old wet petals that have gotten stuck on the plant. But we're going to go through here again, and I'm going to take this down into the bush. And this one, and again this one. Let's get in there. And I'm going to pull off these these old brown petals, and just keep fluffing the bush up a little bit. Again, you want to go down inside, but you don't want to go too low because I want to keep the volume of the bush intact, right? I don't want to look at stems. I just want to look at these nice green leaves, which will stay attractive for the entire rest of the season. And try to get as much as I can the petals off that are just sticking to the bush. So you just keep going through all the way around. And pull off the brown leaves and old petals, just like that. And just sort of shake it out a little bit. As much as you can get these brown petals off of here, the nicer the bush will look. And that is what this peony bush is going to look like, more or less, for the entire rest of the summer. It isn't going to get any bigger, and it isn't going to get any smaller. If you notice that there's some brown on some of the leaves, you can just take those off again, and that will keep this bush looking nice and fresh for the whole rest of the summer. And even though it won't continue blooming, it will make a nice backdrop for the other plants in your garden that are blooming. So now let's go over and talk about some irises. I want to show you how to revitalize an old clump of bearded iris, but I thought you might want to take a look at some other irises that are actually blooming in my garden right now. So come along. I grow about 4 or 5 different species of iris in my garden. Now these amazing purple flowers are Japanese iris. Japanese iris make great garden plants, and they also really like a lot of moisture. So you'll often see them growing near ponds and in wet areas. So if you have a problematic wet area on your property, you might want to try Japanese iris. They're also pretty much the last iris to bloom during the iris season. So the first iris are usually Siberian iris, then bearded iris, then Louisiana iris, and finally the Japanese iris. And if you come with me over here, I'll show you another stand of them. Oh, but actually let's stop and take a look here. This is yellow flag iris, which is just finishing bloom. They're not looking their best right now. But this is also a great wetland plant. This plant loves moisture, can grow almost directly in the water if the water isn't too deep, and just makes these beautiful, tough, strappy leaves. So this is a great wetlands plant. Now these are what is called, and again, after all the rain, they're a little bedraggled, but this is called Louisiana iris. And this again is also a wetland iris. It likes a lot of moisture. And this variety is called black gamecock because of how dark and purple it is. And then over here, we have another Japanese iris. And this one isn't quite as showy as the first one I showed you. The flowers are a little smaller, and again, you can see that they're just starting to go by, but this is a beautiful plant and very low maintenance and easy to take care of if you can give it consistent moisture. But they're really beautiful. Now this is a plant that I actually don't deadhead because once the flower falls, it will make a very pretty seed pod. Also, I like to let some of the seeds form because they will self-seed, and sometimes if you have different varieties growing near each other, you'll get your own unique variety coming up, which I can show you in the other garden maybe if we have time before we finish up. But the iris that I really want to show you how to deal with today is the bearded iris. It's not in bloom now. It probably finished blooming everywhere about 3 or 4 weeks ago, but it's the iris with the really big flower head that comes in lots of different colors and that people love and I love, and they're also quite fragrant. So come over here and I'll show you what we're going to do. Okay, now this is an old stand of a re-blooming bearded iris called Golden Harvest. This is a really unusual bearded iris because unlike most, it actually blooms twice. It blooms in the spring and then it blooms again late in the fall. The problem is that we generally get frost right about the time it's coming into bloom, so I'll often cut the flowers and bring them into the house. Nevertheless, this is a really great plant, but as you can see when you look closely, the leaves are looking ratty and it's very crowded in this space. Believe it or not, when I first planted this iris, there was only 3 plants put in here, and that was about 5 years ago. But now it's become overcrowded and the plants are getting a little tired, and strangely, this is a really good time of year to lift and divide bearded iris. Unlike most perennials, which would probably die if you tried to do that to them this time of year, bearded iris does quite well if you lift and divide it in late June. So what I'm going to do first is take a shovel. I'm going to move some of this mulch away. I'm just going to dig right into this clump, believe it or not, and I'm just going to start lifting a big section of this out of here. Irises aren't very deeply rooted, so they're not that hard to dig up. Go in here, get a little bit behind this clump. Once I get the first clump out, the rest goes a lot quicker. It's getting the first section out that's the hard part. Okay. So they start lifting up and breaking apart, and what I want to show you is you're going to shake off the dirt And on this one, it's a little bit clearer. Now you see this? This is the old tuber, okay? This is already past its prime. It's not going to produce any more growth. If you look really closely at it, sort of soft. It actually doesn't have any really living roots, okay? The part of the plant that's going to bloom again are these at the very end. So what you want to do when you dig them out is take a clippers and cut off those pieces. Then you take a pair of scissors and you neatly cut the plant into a fan like that. This is what is going to produce flowers next year. And this makes a really nice, healthy plant. So you go through and you cut nice, even fans like that. And this is 3 from that little bit that I just took out. I now have 3 good plants. And you keep going. And again, you can see this part, the roots are brown, they're dead. They're not really doing anything. This part has nice, white, healthy roots. So what we're going to do again is we're going to cut these off of the old piece. And then it's actually easier with the scissors to cut the leaves. We're going to cut them into a neat fan, just like that. Okay. Now there's a little bit of a trick to replanting these, and I'm going to actually show you over at a stand I did yesterday. So come back over this way. Now this stand of bearded iris looked exactly like that other stand a couple days ago, until I divided them up, replanted them, and had at least 30 more plants which I gave to friends. Now this is how you plant a bearded iris. The trick is that bearded iris like to have this top tuber part very close to the surface of the soil. You don't want to bury them deeply. You want this part to be just below the surface. So what you do is you dig a hole, just like that, and you sink the roots down into it. You can angle it any direction you want the plant to grow. Remember, this plant is now going to continue growing in that direction. And you put the roots down in the hole and you sort of hold the top of the plant at the surface as you fill in with the soil. And it's that easy. Now you can see on these, you see this leaf sticking up higher than the rest? This is how much they've already started to grow in literally a matter of days since I did this. And I have another stand of a different kind of bearded iris that I did this to a couple years ago, and let's go take a look at that so you can see how quickly these are going to fill in. So come along this way. So this is a stand of bearded iris that I revitalized in exactly the same way that I just taught you about 2 years ago. And they bloomed terrifically this last season. In fact, they just finished blooming a few weeks ago, and you can see how quickly they've started to fill in. So you don't want to plant them too close together. I would say 6 to 8 inches at the closest. And in a couple years, you'll have plants that look like this. There's no brown on them. The other benefit to doing this is that because of the tubers of the iris growing so close to the surface, it's very hard to weed around them. So after a while, a lot of clumps of iris get very weedy. By digging them up and revitalizing them, it also gives me the opportunity to get all the weeds out before I replant. So it's really easy, and that's how you revitalize an old stand of bearded iris. Earlier I mentioned that if you let the seed heads stay on your Japanese irises, they'll often drop seeds that will grow into a new plant, and that new plant may be a very unique variety. That's what happened here. I didn't plant these irises. They grew by themselves, and they look completely different than any other Japanese iris in my garden. So it's sort of a little gift from Mother Nature. This is my dog Puck, and he's a great gardening assistant. It certainly has gotten hot in the garden today, so it's good to remember to rehydrate with a glass of water when you take a break from working. And I thought it might be helpful to review some of the things we've talked about today. First, remember that when you deadhead your roses, you want to cut the stems down to at least the first leaf that has 5 leaflets. You can always go lower than that, but you don't want to go higher. Remember that when you're dividing your bearded iris, you want to only save the sections of the iris that have new leaf growth and fresh, whitish looking roots. And remember that in general, it's a great idea to deadhead almost all the flowers in your garden. It will keep certain plants blooming longer, and it will make your garden look better. I'm Andrew Grossman, this is Puck, and this has been In the Garden. I hope you enjoyed it.